Dr. Lisa Johnson pulled her car into the parking lot of Westfield Shopping Center, checking her watch as she turned off the engine. She had exactly 30 minutes before her next surgery at the hospital, and she desperately needed to use a restroom and grab a quick coffee. The morning had been brutal. 2 emergency surgeries back to back, and she hadn't had a moment to herself since arriving at the hospital at 5 in the morning. Lisa looked at herself in the rearview mirror and sighed. Her scrubs were wrinkled, her hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and she looked every bit as tired as she felt. But she was still wearing her hospital ID badge, clearly identifying her as Dr. L. Johnson, Pediatric Surgery. She grabbed her purse and headed toward the main entrance of Hamilton's department store, one of the upscale shops in the center. The automatic doors whooshed open, and Lisa stepped into the cool, air-conditioned space. The store was busy with the usual afternoon crowd, mostly well-dressed shoppers browsing through racks of expensive clothing and checking out the latest handbags. Soft classical music played overhead, and everything about the place screamed luxury and sophistication. Lisa had been to this store before, though not often. It was the kind of place where a simple t-shirt cost more than most people spent on groceries in a week. But it was convenient, located right between the hospital and her favorite coffee shop, and their restrooms were always clean and well-maintained. As she walked through the entrance, Lisa noticed the usual mix of customers. There were several women her age examining jewelry at the counter near the front, a group of teenagers looking at shoes, and an elderly man sitting in one of the comfortable chairs while his wife shopped nearby. What she couldn't help but notice, though she tried not to think about it too much, was that she was one of the very few black customers in the store. This wasn't unusual for this part of town. The Westfield Shopping Center was located in one of the more affluent areas of the city, where the demographics were predominantly white, and the average income was well above the national average. Lisa had grown accustomed to being one of the few faces of color in many of the places she frequented. As a successful surgeon, she moved in circles where diversity was often lacking, and she had learned to navigate these spaces with confidence and grace. But today, something felt different. Maybe it was because she was tired, or maybe it was because she was wearing scrubs instead of her usual professional attire when she wasn't at the hospital. Whatever it was, she felt more aware of the look she was getting from other customers. Some were simply curious glances, the kind anyone might give to someone in medical scrubs. Others felt more scrutinizing, as if people were trying to figure out whether she belonged there. Lisa pushed these thoughts aside and headed toward the back of the store, where she remembered the restrooms being located. She had been here maybe 3 or 4 times over the past year, usually to grab something quick or use their facilities when she was in the area. Each time had been uneventful. She'd walk in, do what she needed to do, and leave without any issues. As she made her way through the store, Lisa passed by the various departments. The women's clothing section was busy, with sales associates helping customers try on expensive dresses and suits. The handbag section had a small crowd gathered around a display of the season's newest arrivals. Everything looked normal and busy, just like any other weekday afternoon. Near the customer service desk, Lisa paused and looked around, trying to remember exactly where the restrooms were located. The store had been renovated since her last visit, and things looked slightly different. She approached the customer service counter, where a young woman with blonde hair and a bright smile was helping an elderly customer return something. "Excuse me," Lisa said politely, waiting for the associate to finish with her current customer. "Could you tell me where the restrooms are located?" The young woman, whose name tag read Jennifer, smiled warmly. "Of course. They're just past the men's department down that hallway to your right. You can't miss them." "Thank you so much," Lisa replied, grateful for the friendly service. This was exactly the kind of interaction she was used to having in places like this, simple, polite, and efficient. As she headed in the direction Jennifer had indicated, Lisa felt her phone buzz in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw a text message from her colleague at the hospital, Dr. Rodriguez, asking about the status of their next patient. She quickly typed back a response letting him know she'd be back in 20 minutes and that everything was on schedule. The men's department was quieter than the rest of the store, with only a few customers browsing through suits and dress shirts. Lisa walked past the displays of ties and accessories, following the signs that pointed toward the restrooms. She was thinking about her neck surgery, a relatively routine procedure on a 7-year-old boy who had been in a bicycle accident. His parents were nervous, as all parents were, but Lisa had performed this type of surgery hundreds of times. She was confident it would go smoothly. As she rounded the corner toward the hallway where the restrooms were supposed to be, Lisa noticed a man in a dark suit standing near the entrance to the women's restroom. He was talking on his phone, but when he saw her approaching, he quickly ended his call and stepped directly into her path. The man was probably in his early 40s, with graying hair and a stern expression. His suit looked expensive, and he carried himself with the kind of authority that suggested he held some position of power within the store. Lisa assumed he was probably a manager or supervisor of some kind. "Excuse me," she said politely, expecting him to step aside so she could pass. Instead, the man stood his ground and looked her up and down, his eyes taking in her scrubs, her tired appearance, and her hospital ID badge. His expression was serious, almost suspicious, and Lisa felt a small knot form in her stomach. "Can I help you with something?" the man asked, his tone formal and cold. Lisa was taken aback by the question. She had simply been trying to get to the restroom, and now this man was blocking her path and asking what she needed help with. She glanced around, wondering if maybe there was some kind of maintenance work going on or if the restrooms were temporarily closed. "I'm just trying to use the restroom," she said, maintaining her polite tone despite feeling increasingly uncomfortable. The man continued to stare at her, and Lisa realized that this interaction was about to become much more complicated than she had anticipated. Her 30-minute break was ticking away, and all she wanted was to use the facilities and get back to the hospital, where a young patient was waiting for her expertise. Little did she know that this simple request was about to turn into an experience that would change everything. The man in the expensive suit crossed his arms and took a step closer to Lisa, his eyes narrowing as he examined her more closely. His name tag, which Lisa now noticed, read, "Robert Patterson, store manager." The way he was looking at her made her feel like she had done something wrong, though she couldn't imagine what that might be. "I'm going to need to see a receipt," Robert said firmly, his voice carrying an unmistakable tone of authority and suspicion. Lisa blinked, certain she had misheard him. "I'm sorry, what?" "A receipt?" Robert repeated, speaking slowly as if she might not understand. "I need to see proof that you've made a purchase in our store today before I can allow you to use our facilities." The words hit Lisa like a physical blow. She stood there for a moment, processing what he had just said. In all her years of shopping, in all the stores she had visited, in all the places she had simply needed to use a restroom, no one had ever asked her for a receipt. The request was so unexpected, so unreasonable that she almost laughed. "Are you serious?" she asked, her voice still polite but with an edge of disbelief. "Completely serious," Robert replied. "Our restrooms are for paying customers only. Store policy." Lisa looked around the hallway, trying to make sense of what was happening. Just minutes earlier, she had watched a well-dressed white woman walk past them toward the restrooms without anyone stopping her. She had seen an elderly white man emerge from the men's room without anyone asking him for proof of purchase. But here she was, a doctor in scrubs with a hospital ID badge clearly visible, being treated like a potential criminal. "I'm a doctor," she said, pointing to her ID badge. "I work at University Hospital just down the street. I've been here before and no one has ever asked me for a receipt just to use the restroom." Robert glanced at her badge dismissively. "Anyone can get one of those made," he said with a shrug. "I've seen all kinds of fake IDs. The policy is the policy. No receipt, no restroom." The casual way he dismissed her credentials, her profession, her very identity, sent a surge of anger through Lisa's chest. She had spent 12 years in school and training to become a surgeon. She had saved countless lives, including children who had been brought to her in their darkest moments. She was respected in her field, trusted by families to care for their most precious possessions. And this man was standing here suggesting that her hospital ID badge was fake. "This is ridiculous," Lisa said, her voice rising slightly despite her efforts to stay calm. "I'm not asking for anything unreasonable. I just need to use the restroom." "And I'm just doing my job," Robert shot back. "We've had problems with people coming in here who aren't customers using our facilities, sometimes causing trouble. The policy exists for a reason." As if to prove her point, a middle-aged white woman in a tennis outfit walked past them, heading directly for the women's restroom. Robert didn't even glance in her direction, let alone ask her for a receipt. The woman disappeared into the restroom without any interaction whatsoever. Lisa pointed toward the restroom door. "You didn't ask her for a receipt?" Robert followed her gaze and shrugged again. She's a regular customer. I know her. How do you know I'm not a regular customer? Lisa challenged. Because I would remember you, Robert said, and there was something in the way he said it that made Lisa's skin crawl. The implication was clear. Even if Robert wouldn't say it directly, he would remember her because she was black, because she stood out in his predominantly white customer base, because in his mind she didn't belong there. Lisa had experienced subtle racism before, but this was different. This was bold, unapologetic discrimination happening in broad daylight in a public place. Look, Lisa said, trying one more time to appeal to his sense of reason. I'm a pediatric surgeon. I have a surgery scheduled in 20 minutes. I just need to use your restroom and then I'll be on my way. I'm not causing any trouble. But Robert seemed to interpret her persistence as defiance. His face hardened and he stepped even closer to her, invading her personal space in a way that felt threatening. I don't care what you claim to be, he said, his voice now openly hostile. The answer is no. If you don't have a receipt, you need to leave the store immediately. This is unbelievable, Lisa said, shaking her head. Are you seriously going to stand there and tell me that I can't use a public restroom because of the color of my skin? This has nothing to do with color, Robert snapped, though his defensive tone suggested otherwise. This is about store policy and security. You're the one making this about race. Lisa felt her heart pounding in her chest. She was a composed person by nature, someone who had learned to navigate difficult situations with grace and professionalism. But this situation was testing every ounce of self-control she possessed. She was being discriminated against, humiliated, and treated like a second-class citizen, all because she had asked to use a restroom. Fine, she said, reaching for her phone. Let me call the corporate office and ask them about this policy. The suggestion seemed to make Robert even angrier. Don't you threaten me, he said, pointing a finger at her. I'm the manager of this store and what I say goes. You're being disruptive and argumentative and I want you out of here right now. Disruptive? Lisa repeated incredulously. I asked to use your restroom. How is that disruptive? You're raising your voice, you're being confrontational, and you're refusing to follow store policy, Robert said, his own voice getting louder. That's the definition of disruptive behavior. Other customers were starting to notice the commotion. Lisa could see people turning to look at them, some stopping their shopping to watch what was unfolding. She felt exposed and embarrassed, but she also felt a burning sense of injustice. This man was trying to paint her as the problem when all she had done was ask for basic human dignity. I need you to leave, Robert said again, this time with more force. If you don't leave voluntarily, I'll call security and have you escorted out. Lisa stood there weighing her options. She could leave as Robert was demanding. She could walk away, find another place to use the restroom, and try to put this humiliating experience behind her. That would certainly be the path of least resistance. But something inside her rebelled against that idea. She was tired of always taking the path of least resistance when it came to discrimination. She was tired of making other people comfortable by pretending that their prejudice didn't affect her. She was tired of being the good black person who never caused waves, never stood up for herself, never demanded to be treated with basic respect. No, she said quietly but firmly. I'm not leaving. Robert's face flushed with anger. Then you leave me no choice, he said, reaching for his radio. Security to the restroom area immediately. We have a situation. As Robert made the call, Lisa realized that this encounter had moved far beyond a simple misunderstanding. She was about to be branded as a security threat, potentially arrested, all because she had dared to ask for the same treatment that white customers received without question. But she also realized something else. She wasn't going to back down. Not this time. Not when she was so clearly in the right. Not when the injustice was so obvious and so wrong. Whatever happened next, she was going to face it with her dignity intact. What neither Lisa nor Robert knew was that someone had been watching their entire interaction from the beginning. Helen Torres, a regional director for Hamilton's department store chain, had arrived at the store 30 minutes earlier for one of her unannounced visits. These surprise inspections were part of her regular routine, designed to ensure that all locations were maintaining the company's standards for customer service and store operations. Helen had been observing the store from various vantage points, taking notes on everything from the cleanliness of the displays to the way employees interacted with customers. She had positioned herself near a rack of women's coats, pretending to examine the merchandise while actually watching the flow of foot traffic and customer service interactions. When she saw Robert approach Lisa near the restrooms, Helen's attention was immediately drawn to the conversation. At first, she assumed it was a routine customer service interaction. Maybe Robert was giving directions or offering assistance. But as she watched the body language and saw Robert's increasingly aggressive posture, she realized something else was happening entirely. Helen moved closer, positioning herself behind a display of handbags where she could hear the conversation more clearly. What she heard made her blood run cold. As a regional director, she was intimately familiar with company policy, and she knew without a doubt that there was no such thing as a receipt required for restroom use policy. In fact, such a policy would violate several corporate guidelines about customer service and accessibility. She watched in horror as Robert dismissed Lisa's professional credentials and continued to escalate the situation. When she saw the white woman in the tennis outfit walk past without being stopped, Helen knew exactly what she was witnessing. This wasn't about store policy or security. This was discrimination, plain and simple. Helen had been with Hamilton's for 15 years, working her way up from a sales associate to her current position. She had seen instances of subtle bias before, and the company had invested heavily in diversity and inclusion training precisely to prevent situations like this. But she had never witnessed anything so blatant, so clearly discriminatory happening in one of her stores. As Robert called for security, Helen knew she had to act. She couldn't stand by and watch a customer be humiliated and potentially arrested for asking to use a restroom. More than that, she couldn't allow one of her managers to drag the company's reputation through the mud with such obviously discriminatory behavior. But she also knew she had to be strategic about her approach. If she revealed her identity too early, Robert might try to backtrack or make excuses. She wanted to see exactly how far he would take this situation, and she wanted witnesses to his behavior. By now, a small crowd had gathered. Other customers had stopped their shopping to watch the confrontation, and several employees had emerged from various departments to see what was causing the commotion. Helen noticed that some people were holding up their phones, apparently recording the interaction. Lisa stood her ground as Robert finished his security call, her dignity intact despite the humiliating circumstances. She looked around at the growing crowd of onlookers, many of whom were now openly staring at the scene unfolding before them. "Is there a problem here?" a voice called out from the crowd. Helen looked to see who had spoken and saw an elderly black woman stepping forward. The woman was well-dressed and carried herself with the kind of quiet authority that came from years of fighting battles and standing up for what was right. "No problem at all," Robert said quickly, clearly uncomfortable with the growing attention. "Just a customer who needs to follow store policy." "What policy would that be?" the elderly woman asked, her voice calm but firm. Before Robert could answer, another voice joined the conversation. A young white man holding his phone up said, "I've been recording this whole thing, and I didn't hear you ask anyone else for a receipt to use the bathroom." "Me neither," added a woman standing nearby. "I just used the restroom 5 minutes ago and nobody asked me for anything." Robert's face was getting redder by the minute. The situation was spiraling out of his control, and he could see that public opinion was clearly not on his side. But instead of backing down or reconsidering his position, he seemed to double down on his authority. "I don't have to explain store policy to every person who walks in here," he said loudly. "This woman is being disruptive and refusing to comply with reasonable requests. That's why I called security." "Reasonable request?" Lisa repeated, her voice carrying a mix of disbelief and anger. "Asking me for a receipt to use a restroom is reasonable? Treating me differently than every other customer who's walked past here is reasonable?" Helen watched as Lisa maintained her composure even in the face of such obvious discrimination. She was impressed by the woman's dignity and strength, but she was also furious at Robert's behavior. This was exactly the kind of incident that could result in lawsuits, protests, and massive negative publicity for the company. A young mother with 2 small children pushed through the crowd, her face flushed with indignation. "This is absolutely disgusting," she said, addressing Robert directly. "I shop here all the time, and I've never seen anything like this. You should be ashamed of yourself, ma'am." "I'm going to have to ask you to mind your own business," Robert replied, his professional facade cracking under the pressure. "This is everyone's business," the woman shot back. "We're all watching you discriminate against this woman for no reason other than the color of her skin." More voices joined in from the crowd. Some people were expressing support for Lisa, while others were questioning Robert's actions. The situation was rapidly becoming a public relations nightmare, but Robert seemed unable or unwilling to recognize how badly he was handling things. Just then, 2 security guards arrived on the scene. Helen recognized them as employees of the private security company that Hamilton's contracted with. They looked around at the crowd and the obvious tension in the air, clearly uncertain about what exactly they were supposed to do. "What seems to be the problem here?" the older of the 2 guards asked. Robert immediately stepped forward. "This woman," he said, pointing at Lisa, "is refusing to follow store policy and being disruptive. I need her removed from the premises." The security guard looked at Lisa, taking in her scrubs, her hospital ID badge, and her calm demeanor. He then looked around at the crowd of angry customers, many of whom were now openly criticizing Robert's behavior. "What exactly did she do?" the guard asked. "She asked to use the restroom without making a purchase," Robert said, as if this explained everything. The security guard looked confused. "That's it?" "She asked to use the restroom. Store policy requires a receipt for restroom access," Robert insisted. "Since when?" the guard asked. He had worked security at Hamilton's for 3 years and had never heard of any such policy. Helen decided it was time to step forward. She had seen and heard enough to know that Robert had crossed every possible line. She moved through the crowd, her corporate ID badge clearly visible on her jacket. "Excuse me?" she said in a clear, authoritative voice. "I'm Helen Torres, Regional Director for Hamilton's Department Stores. I think there's been a serious misunderstanding here." The crowd fell silent as Helen approached. Robert's face went completely white as he realized who was speaking. Lisa looked at Helen with a mixture of hope and skepticism, unsure what this new development might mean. Helen looked around at the assembled crowd, the security guards, and finally at Robert. She knew that whatever happened next would determine not only Lisa's immediate experience but also the future of Robert's career and potentially the reputation of the entire store chain. "Mr. Patterson," she said, her voice calm but carrying unmistakable authority, "could you please explain to me what Hamilton's policy is regarding restroom access for customers?" Robert opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He knew, just as Helen knew, that there was no such policy. He had been caught in a lie, and now he was going to have to face the consequences of his actions in front of a crowd of witnesses and his regional supervisor. The moment of truth had arrived, and there was nowhere left for him to hide. Robert's mouth opened and closed several times as he struggled to find words. The confidence and authority he had displayed just moments before had completely evaporated in the face of his regional director's direct question. Sweat was beginning to form on his forehead, and his hands were visibly shaking. "Well," he stammered, "I mean, we have to be careful about security and, making sure that only legitimate customers use our facilities." Helen's expression remained completely neutral, but her eyes were sharp as she continued to study Robert. "I see, and is this a written policy that you can show me? Because I'm quite familiar with all of Hamilton's corporate policies, and I don't recall ever seeing anything about requiring receipts for restroom access." The crowd around them had grown even larger. Word was spreading throughout the store that something significant was happening, and employees were abandoning their posts to see what was going on. Several people were still recording with their phones, and Helen knew that whatever happened here would likely be shared across social media within hours. "It's more of an informal policy," Robert said weakly. "You know, something we do to prevent problems." "Problems," Helen repeated. "What kind of problems are you referring to, Mr. Patterson?" Robert looked around desperately as if searching for support from somewhere in the crowd. But the faces staring back at him ranged from curious to openly hostile. Even his own employees were looking at him with confusion and embarrassment. "Sometimes people come in who aren't really customers," he said. "They might cause trouble or, make other customers uncomfortable." "I see," Helen said. "And what about Dr. Johnson here made you think she might cause trouble or make customers uncomfortable?" For the first time, Robert looked directly at Lisa. She was standing quietly, her arms crossed, watching the exchange with the same calm professionalism she brought to her work in the operating room. Her hospital ID was clearly visible, Her scrubs were clean and pressed, and there was nothing about her appearance or demeanor that suggested she was anything other than a medical professional, taking a break from her duties. Well, she didn't have a receipt, Robert said lamely. Neither did Mrs. Chen, who walked past you into the restroom just 5 minutes ago, Helen pointed out, or Mr. Williams, who emerged from the men's room shortly before that, or the teenage girl who used the facilities about 10 minutes ago. I've been observing this area for quite some time now, Mr. Patterson, and Dr. Johnson is the only person you've asked for a receipt. The elderly black woman who had spoken up earlier stepped forward slightly. I knew it, she said, shaking her head. I've seen this kind of thing too many times before. One of the security guards, the younger of the two, spoke up. If it helps, I actually know Dr. Johnson from the hospital. My daughter was a patient there last year. Dr. Johnson performed emergency surgery on her after a car accident. She saved my little girl's life. The guard's words hit the crowd like a physical blow. Here was a woman who had literally saved a child's life, being treated like a criminal for asking to use a restroom. The injustice of it was so stark, so obvious, that several people in the crowd began expressing their outrage more openly. This is disgusting, someone called out. She's a doctor. For crying out loud, another person added. How can you treat someone like this? A third voice demanded. Lisa finally spoke, her voice steady but carrying the weight of her frustration and hurt. I've been a surgeon for 8 years, she said, addressing Helen directly. I've performed over 2,000 operations. I've saved lives, including the lives of children. And today, I was told that I couldn't use a public restroom because I didn't have a receipt to prove I belonged here. She paused, looking around at the faces in the crowd. But we all know this wasn't really about a receipt, don't we? This was about the fact that I'm a black woman, in a space where someone decided I didn't belong. This was about someone looking at me and making assumptions based on nothing more than the color of my skin. The silence that followed Lisa's words was deafening. Helen looked around at the crowd, seeing the mix of anger, embarrassment, and solidarity on people's faces. This was exactly the kind of situation that she and other corporate leaders had spent countless hours in training sessions trying to prevent. Dr. Johnson, Helen said, turning to face Lisa directly, on behalf of Hamilton's department stores, I want to offer you my sincerest apologies. What you've experienced here today is absolutely unacceptable and goes against everything our company claims to stand for. She then turned back to Robert, her voice taking on a harder edge. Mr. Patterson, in my 15 years with this company, I have never witnessed such a clear violation of our customer service standards and our basic principles of human decency. Not only is there no policy requiring receipts for restroom access, but there are specific corporate guidelines that explicitly prohibit the kind of discriminatory behavior you've displayed here today. Robert tried one more desperate attempt to justify his actions. I was just trying to maintain security and order in the store. I didn't mean anything by it. You didn't mean anything by it? Helen repeated, her voice rising slightly. Mr. Patterson, you singled out one customer, a medical professional, I might add, for treatment that you applied to no one else. You questioned her credentials, dismissed her profession, and threatened to have her arrested for asking to use a restroom. And you did all of this while multiple witnesses watched you allow other customers to use the same facilities without question. The young man who had been recording the interaction held up his phone. I've got the whole thing on video, he said. Everything from the beginning, Helen nodded. Good, because this kind of behavior cannot and will not be tolerated at Hamilton's. We've spent years building our reputation as a welcoming, inclusive retailer, and I will not allow one person's prejudice to destroy that. She looked around at the crowd, making eye contact with as many people as possible. To everyone who witnessed this today, I want you to know that this is not who we are as a company. This is not how Hamilton's trains its employees to treat customers, and this is certainly not how any human being should be treated anywhere, for any reason. Dr. Johnson spoke up again. I appreciate your apology, she said to Helen, but I think it's important that people understand that this isn't an isolated incident. This kind of discrimination happens every day, in stores and restaurants and hotels and offices across the country. The only difference is that today, it happened in front of witnesses who were willing to speak up. Several people in the crowd nodded in agreement. The elderly black woman who had spoken earlier stepped forward. She's right, she said. I'm 72 years old, and I've been dealing with this kind of treatment my entire life. The only reason we're talking about it now is because people had their phones out and because this young woman was brave enough to stand her ground. Helen felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about one bad employee or one unfortunate incident. This was about systemic issues that went far beyond the walls of her store. But she also knew that how she handled this situation right now would send a message, not just to her employees, but to her customers and to the community at large. "Dr. Johnson," she said, "I know that an apology can't undo what happened here today, but I want to make sure that there are real consequences for this behavior. And I want to make sure that changes are made to prevent anything like this from happening again." Lisa nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I appreciate that. But the real question is, what are you going to do about it?" All eyes turned to Helen as she prepared to answer that question. The crowd waited in silence, knowing that whatever she said next would determine whether this incident would be remembered as just another example of discrimination that went unpunished, or as a moment when someone in power actually took meaningful action to address injustice. Helen took a deep breath. Knowing that her next words would be among the most important of her career, she looked directly at Robert, then at Lisa, and finally at the crowd of witnesses who had gathered around them. "Dr. Johnson," she said, her voice clear and firm. "First, I want to personally escort you to our executive restroom, which is private and comfortable. You shouldn't have to wait another moment for basic courtesy and respect." She then turned to address the crowd. "To everyone here today, I want you to know that what you witnessed is completely unacceptable. Hamilton's department stores has zero tolerance for discrimination of any kind, and we will be taking immediate action." Helen walked over to Robert, who was now visibly sweating and appeared to be in a state of shock. "Mr. Patterson, I need to speak with you privately." "Right now." But Lisa stepped forward. "With respect, Ms. Torres, I think whatever you have to say to him should be said in front of all these witnesses. This didn't happen in private, and the consequences shouldn't be handled in private either." Helen paused, considering Lisa's request. It was unusual to handle personnel matters in public, but then again, this was an unusual situation. The discrimination had happened in full view of customers and employees, and perhaps the response needed to be equally transparent. "You're absolutely right," Helen said. "Mr. Patterson, after witnessing your behavior today, and after confirming that you violated multiple company policies, I am terminating your employment with Hamilton's department stores, effective immediately." A murmur went through the crowd. Some people nodded in approval, while others seemed surprised by the swiftness of the action. Robert's face went completely white. "You can't do this," he said, his voice shaky. "I've worked here for 6 years. I've never had any complaints before." "Mr. Patterson," Helen replied, "in the past 30 minutes you have discriminated against a customer based on her race, lied about company policy, dismissed the credentials of a medical professional, created a hostile environment for other customers, and called security to remove someone whose only crime was asking to use a restroom. Any one of these actions would be grounds for termination. Together, they represent such a serious breach of our values that continuing your employment is impossible." The elderly black woman who had spoken up earlier began clapping slowly. Soon others in the crowd joined in, creating a wave of applause that seemed to validate Helen's decision. Helen continued, "Dr. Johnson, beyond my personal apology, Hamilton's will be making a formal apology to you in writing. We will also be making a significant donation to University Hospital's pediatric department in your honor, and we would like to invite you to participate in our company's diversity and inclusion training program as a consultant." Lisa looked surprised by the offer. "That's very generous, but I'm not sure. Please consider it," Helen interrupted gently. "We clearly have work to do, and we need people like you to help us do it better." One of the customers, a middle-aged white man who had been watching the entire interaction, stepped forward. "I've been shopping at Hamilton's for 15 years, he said. "I'm glad to see you taking action, but I have to ask, how do we know this kind of thing isn't happening in your other stores?" It was a fair question, and Helen knew it. "You're right to ask," she said. "This incident is going to prompt a company-wide review of our practices and additional training for all employees. We're also going to be implementing new policies to ensure that any customer who experiences discrimination has multiple ways to report it and get immediate assistance." The young man who had recorded the incident held up his phone again. "I've already posted this video on social media. It's been shared hundreds of times in just the past few minutes." Helen nodded. "I understand, and I respect your right to share what you witnessed. In fact, I hope people do see it. I hope they see that when discrimination happens at Hamilton's, there are immediate consequences. She turned to address the entire crowd. I also want everyone here to know that Dr. Johnson showed incredible grace and dignity in an impossible situation. She could have left when things got difficult, but she stood her ground and demanded to be treated with respect. That took courage, and I hope her example inspires others to speak up when they witness injustice. Lisa smiled for the first time since the ordeal began. "Thank you," she said. "But I hope the real lesson here is that this kind of discrimination is happening everywhere, every day. Most of the time there aren't cameras rolling and regional directors watching. Most of the time people like Mr. Patterson get away with it." She looked around at the crowd, making eye contact with as many people as possible. "If you really want to make a difference, don't just applaud when someone gets fired for being caught on camera. Pay attention to the subtle ways that people are treated differently. Notice when someone is followed around a store, or when someone's ID is questioned while others aren't asked for anything. Notice and speak up." An older white woman near the back of the crowd raised her hand tentatively. "I have to admit, I've seen things like this before and I didn't say anything. I always told myself it wasn't my business or that maybe I was misreading the situation." "That's exactly the problem," Lisa said gently. "Discrimination thrives in silence. It depends on people looking the other way, making excuses or convincing themselves that what they're seeing isn't really happening." The security guard who had recognized Lisa from the hospital spoke up. "Dr. Johnson, I just want to say thank you again for everything you did for my daughter. And I'm sorry you had to go through this today." "Thank you," Lisa replied. "But you know what? Your daughter's recovery, and the hundreds of other children I've been able to help. That's what makes all of this worth it. I won't let one ignorant person make me forget why I do what I do." Helen looked at her watch and realized that Lisa's break time had long since expired. "Dr. Johnson, I know you need to get back to the hospital. Please let me walk you to our executive facilities, and then I'll have security escort you to your car if you'd like." As they prepared to move through the crowd, the elderly black woman approached Lisa. "Sweetheart," she said, taking Lisa's hand, "I want you to know how proud I am of you. You stood up not just for yourself but for all of us who have been in situations like this." "We have to stand up for each other," Lisa replied. "That's the only way things change." As Helen led Lisa toward the executive restroom, Robert was escorted out of the store by security, carrying a box with his personal belongings. Several customers were already on their phones, calling friends and family to tell them what they had witnessed. The young man with the video was fielding requests from local news stations who wanted to interview him about the incident. By evening, the story would be trending on multiple social media platforms, sparking conversations about discrimination, corporate responsibility, and the importance of bystander intervention. But for Lisa, the most important outcome was simpler than all the publicity and policy changes. As she finally used the restroom, the same restroom she had asked to use over an hour earlier, she felt a sense of vindication and hope. She had stood up for herself, demanded respect, and refused to be treated as less than human. 20 minutes later, she was back in the operating room, her hands steady and her focus complete as she performed surgery on the 7-year-old boy who had been waiting for her. The discrimination she had faced was still fresh in her mind, but it didn't define her.
She was Dr. Lisa Johnson, pediatric surgeon.
And she had work to do. The boy's surgery was successful, and as Lisa spoke with his relieved parents afterward, she was reminded once again of why her work mattered so much. She saved lives. She made a difference, and no amount of prejudice could take that away from her. Outside the hospital, the story of what had happened at Hamilton's continued to spread, sparking conversations and inspiring others to examine their own actions and assumptions. Change, Lisa knew, happened one conversation, one confrontation, one moment of courage at a time. And sometimes it happened when someone simply refused to accept being treated as anything less than human.